Welcome to Module 2 of Gender and Communication. And in this module, we will be specifically looking at the role of gender in two categories of communication that are very important. Verbal, which is language, and nonverbal, which refers to communicating with the body. So we're going to be having some lectures on those topics. And in this lecture, I want to remind you of the objectives of the module and remind you to keep these in mind as you're listening to my ideas. Objective number 1 for Module 2 is to name and explain terms associated with verbal and nonverbal communication. Objective number 2, to recognize the impact that gender has on verbal communication. And objective number 3 is to recognize the impact that gender has on nonverbal communication. So we begin today with a conversation about language. And language is hugely important because language is our perception. Language is a symbolic construct, and what that means is that language and words represent something, and it gives human beings the capacity to talk about all kinds of complicated ideas. When we look at meaning in language, we know that language has both a denotative and a connotative meaning. So denotative meaning is really the literal dictionary meaning of language, and connotative meaning would be more of our emotional, experiential reaction to language. So let's take gender and talk about denotation and connotation. Something as simple as the word girl. If we looked up girl in the dictionary, it would likely tell us that it was some form of a gender term given to a female child. And that's accurate, right? But if we think connotatively about the word girl, it has a lot more meaning. We begin to understand how girls occupy spaces, why somebody might both adopt and love the word girl and apply it to their own identity, or they may reject it and say, I don't want you to call me a girl because that makes me a child. It comes with power, it comes with stereotyping, and so the connotative quality of that word becomes a part of the conversation we need to be having. Language is also governed by rules. So we know that language we understand grammar and spelling and syntax and all the ways that we've agreed within a particular language to communicate with one another. And that's why these rules get challenged when we begin to think about things like transgender pronouns that people have asked us to use or that we've chosen to use. How do we navigate talking about somebody if we're not using he and she and instead using they or their? And how does that push and challenge some of the taken for granted rules of language, especially in the English language? We know that language is developed within our cultural groups. And we can think of gender as a co-cultural group or a smaller cultural group within a larger culture in which we have membership. And so as we are socialized into masculinity and femininity, we begin to see that there emerges this kind of in-group or out-group use of language that identifies us as part of a particular cultural group. There's an interesting study done on in-group language for sports teams and how boys and men will oftentimes create language that allows them to be considered part of the team, and then language that excludes the people that do not have the capacity, and in our case we're talking about gender, and maybe the masculine capacity to be a part of that inside circle. So we know that happens through all kinds of ways that we include people and exclude people according to the way that they successfully perform their gender. We know that language changes. It changes over time. It often reflects the values and experiences of groups of people in very specific time contexts. So words like cisgender and non-binary and heteronormative may not be words that we were using even 10 or 15 years ago. Because what we also understand in relationship to that is that we use language to describe our experiences in the world. So 50 or 60 years ago, we didn't use the term sexual harassment. It wasn't until we acknowledged that women were experiencing sexual harassment in the home, in schools, and in workplaces that we began to put a label on it and then talk about it more openly and address it. And today we have #MeToo, which takes language and gives it even more of a mobile ability to describe what exists and the experiences of the people who are in gendered bodies. We know that language is very much linked to power, and to interrogate that is a very long conversation, but I wanted to highlight and feature some of the ways that we can begin to understand language and power. And the first is the existence of something called masculine gendered language or male gendered language. And that's when people, without even thinking about it, embed masculine terms when it could be applied to both men or women. Common examples of male generic or masculine gendered language is the pronoun he. So inserting the pronoun he when you mean both he and she, but assuming that there's this umbrella he. There's also a lot of specific titles and terms we have in English language that imply the same thing. Congressman is an example of that. We may say, who is your local congressman? And that representative may actually be a woman. Even the common use of the word mankind is a good example of this. Another way that language and power intersect is through something called marked language. And marked language is when we unnecessarily mark language to imply gender or sex. And it applies to other categories of identities, but if we use it in this course, we're talking about something like, we hear some people say, a woman soldier. Implied that soldier is understood as a job that men do, and therefore if a woman is doing that job, we need to mark it. And what that marking does is it makes it stand out as unusual. The same is true of something like male nurse. We even do it with sexualities, and people do it. It's not intended to be pointing you out as being unusual, but it does have that effect. So people will say sometimes my gay friend. And it's often about being marked by a minority status or something that people are not expecting you to say. So again, it's this idea of marking language unnecessarily. Language and power has a lot to do with the labels that we apply to ourselves and that others apply to us. So even something like Mr. or Mrs. will imply a particular gendering or position about gender. So some women will change their name when they get married to a man, and they will then call themselves by that man's last name. And oftentimes, sometimes they will actually utilize only Mrs. So-and-so, and in what that's doing is kind of an erasure of their entire name that they had prior to that marriage. Even labels like the word queer, where that became a term that we've talked about in the first set of lectures. Queer becomes a way of thinking about gender identities, but it also becomes a label that we assign to others as well as a label that we might self-assign. Which leads me to a final conversation I want to have about power and language, and that is the reappropriation of language. So if you take that word queer, queer has historically been used as a derogatory term to describe people who identify as gay, and yet what we know from our lectures is queer has been reappropriated back to mean many different things to the people who have been attacked with that language, and the same can be true of any number of gendered terms that people have used to attempt to have negative stereotypes about people. So let's shift away from power and talk a little bit about some kind of important terms and theories that apply to language. As I said earlier, there's a lot we could talk about with language, but these will give you kind of some focus to think about when you think about gender and language. And the first is the idea of a speech act. A speech act is when we use language in a way that implies action. So the ways that we say things imply that we are taking some type of action, or we are asserting some type of action. So you take a sentence like, I am a woman, or I am a man. How that operates as a speech act is very strategic. Along with that notion of woman or man comes a lot of perceptions and understandings, and therefore when I make that statement, and it doesn't depend what body I am in that makes that statement, I'm acting on that and then assuming a particular identity, expecting you to interact with me in a particular way. So it has this ability to actually create action. Another term, when we're talking about terms and theories of language that are important to the study of gender, is the idea of a script. And a script is a predictable way of communicating. People agree to these particular scripts and they interact with one another. And you don't deviate from the script. I talk like this, you talk like that. And when we link it to gender, we know that it's really embedded in those gendered roles that we talked about earlier. So I am supposed to communicate like this, and if I don't communicate like that, I've broken the script, and therefore I've not done a good job of embodying that gendered role. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about how narrative theory might help us understand language and gender. And when we look at narrative, we understand that people understand themselves and their world through storytelling. And stories are very important to gender, both as a way to construct gender, let me tell you my story, and also as a way to understand who has access to things like history, who is able to use language in ways to have control and power. And so we really are interested in how women's stories may operate differently in society than men's stories. And stories and storytelling has always been a place for women's lives to be celebrated and explored. And so narrative becomes a way for us to utilize language in those ways. So this lecture has introduced you to the idea that there is a reciprocal relationship between gender and language. And as you think about Lecture 1 in Module 2, I want you to consider some of the following questions. Number 1, how do you construct meaning for gender in the ways that you use specific words? Number 2, how are the rules of the languages you speak influenced by gender? Number 3, can you identify places, media, school, workplaces, where marked language or masculine gendered language is used frequently? Question 4, what might happen if you were to resist using language that followed a gendered script? Question 5, how do your own stories change how you understand yourself as a gendered person?